Welcome to the only place where real, raw, and vulnerable conversations happen with IFBB bikini pros to give you an inside look at their struggles, strategies, mindset, passions, and all of life beyond the stage. This podcast is made to inspire, motivate, and remind competitors and the average gym goer that even the most extreme lifestyles and elite athletes have their ups and downs. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I'm your host, Celeste Rains-Turk, and now it's time for the Confessions of a Bikini Pro podcast. Our third guest of the Coach series is so special to me. She and I have hosted events together, and we were online friends for years before we joined forces to do any of that. And I wanted to bring her on for her incredible ability to build her community within her work as a coach for Team ProPhysique since 2019. And you guys know I had Paul Revelia on one of the coaches series years ago. But I wanted to highlight this coach from his team of coaches. And she is a NASM certified personal trainer with her Bachelor of Science degree in Exercise Physiology from the University of Tampa. And prior to online coaching, she worked as an in-person trainer at a local gym in Tampa. And she herself has been competing since 2017. And in her first competition prep, she literally prepped out of a dorm room. And I love that story. So we'll have to hear that. And then she took some time off before returning to the stage. So I'm really excited to welcome to the show, Lexie Maitland. How are you doing?
I am doing so good, Celeste. I am so happy and honored to be on your podcast finally.
I know, me too. And I know we'll one day have you on as like a bikini pro to share her confessions, but like I'm really just glad that you're here as a coach. And I think that's in some ways really commendable too, because a lot of people think you have to be a pro to be successful as a coach or to build such a great community or to have such a great background in this sport and understanding of this sport. So I actually kind of like that we're getting to do the coaches series together.
Oh my gosh, me too. I am just so excited and this is going to be such a great episode.
Agreed. So, yeah, so you guys, I always like to preface, I don't have bias in the coaches series. I'm really just trying to get an understanding of every single coach's philosophy. But Lexie, let me ask you, what is something you do or think about before your clients hit the stage?
Ooh, okay, that's a good one. I didn't even think I was like kind of trying to prepare. What did I think you were going to ask me? So something I think about before my clients hit the stage or if like there's anything that I do. So it is kind of, dependent obviously with online coaching. I have I get to be in person at some of my clients shows, but of course sometimes that doesn't happen, right? If I have two different clients in two different states one day, I wish I could be in one, every spot every weekend, but so it kind of differs there, depends, if I'm there in person or not. But oh gosh, I mean, I think the biggest thing that goes through my mind is like, just, I hope they have fun. Cause I think that's the biggest thing I worry about as a coach, because regardless of, how they do placement wise, of course, we want them to do well, but did they have fun? Right. Like I always ask, usually my girls, once they get off stage, whether it was their first time or they've done this before, how did you feel? Like, how was it? Right. And, they'll either say, oh my gosh, I was super nervous and jittery. But then, by the time I went on for open, it was a lot more like smooth and natural. Or sometimes they'll tell me, oh my gosh, I just felt amazing, it was so much fun. So I just always go into it and I hope that they have fun. That's the biggest thing I think of.
That's a great point because I think the experience makes a big difference in someone's overall perception of it. And you know that you can enjoy the lifestyle, you can enjoy the grind of this, but sometimes the stage isn't for everyone, or sometimes it kind of reveals too, I think. And I'm sure this has probably happened, but when you ask a client that and they seem to have hated it, it's like, well, what happened? Was it because of the outcome or was it because you actually didn't like the process? Because you seem to like the process. And I know as an athlete, my first show, I was like, I love this. And then I didn't win. I was like, I hate this, you know? So I'm curious if that's ever happened.
Yeah, and you know what's funny? Because I've had, I work with a lot of newer competitors, but then of course I've had girls that have been working with me now for years and they've competed a couple times. And I've even had girls that maybe they didn't place how they necessarily wanted to at the show, but it's their second or third or fourth show that we've done together, and they're like, Lexi, this is my absolute like best. I was so confident. Even though I didn't place how I wanted to, like I just felt so good out there on stage. Like I gave everything I could. And I think it really does take a sense of maturity for somebody to get to that point, right? But I've also had, like, every once in a while, there may be, a situation where the show day is not ideal for a client. Like, I had a client one time, her cell phone like actually broke on show day. So that was an added stressor. And then obviously it was hard for her to get a hold of me. So like that made the show day a little bit, different. Had nothing to do with her getting on stage, just the show day in general. So yeah, and then that's why I always encourage girls to, compete more than once, because sometimes you do get into that
Mhm.
first show and it may not be your most like your best show or your best experience, but I think if you can do it a couple times, that's when you really do get an idea of, okay, is this for me, or is this maybe something that like I don't enjoy as much as I thought I would?
That's a great point. And I think after doing so many shows myself, and you know this too, like different promoters do things differently, and so your actual experience as an athlete can vary based on the show that you're doing. You've talked about your experience at Texas shows and your great joy in that, and
Oh,
I've had great experiences with. I've done mostly muscle contest shows, and then I did Gary Udit's North American. Like I've had, and I've done a Samson show. So like, and this year I want to do a class show because I've gotten so close with Joe.
I love Joe. Joe's amazing. Oh my gosh, yes, and one of the things like I have really loved about, I mean, I know I'm young, but I feel like I've been around in like the industry for a little bit of time now where I followed, I've gone to shows year after year, the same shows year after year, and you kind of start like as a coach to learn the different shows and how each promoter works, right? And what the show experience is like for the athlete. So that is one thing. I know a lot of first time competitors, they get into it, they have absolutely no idea of like, okay, what show should I do, right? So as a coach, I always kind of like to help my client pick their show based off of, shows in particular too that I know, oh gosh, this show, the promoter always does a great job at, putting it on. The athlete has a great experience, because the last thing I would want to do is put a client in a show that just they just have a really bad experience because of the way it's run, right? But yes, I love Joe's shows. The class shows are amazing. And it's funny because I've actually, granted I'm in Florida, so I'm not on the West Coast. I've never done a muscle contest show, but I know that muscle contest and center podium are really big on the West Coast. So being in Florida, I have a lot more experience with like Tim Gardner shows, class shows. I've also the Texas shows. Oh my gosh, amazing. I highly recommend, if you are somebody listening, like Texas shows are just crazy awesome. The way they treat their athletes, the experience, that is still to this day my favorite show experience was the Republic of Texas that I did. It was fabulous.
That's actually very good to know because I think it's important not to judge the entire industry based off of like let's say one show experience. Like you said, it's important to do more than one unless you really know like the process just wasn't for you. But if you really enjoyed the process and want to compete again, I even know some people who don't even like show day, but they like to compete. So it's an interesting, it's just interesting. And I want to ask you your thoughts on overall coaching philosophy because this is a unique situation. I'm speaking with you as Lexie, and I know you, and I've worked with you obviously, and I refer clients to you too. But something that stands out to me is you're a coach under another team, or I should say with another team, and you were mentored by Paul. What is your personal coaching philosophy, and how much of that was influenced by maybe that mentorship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I knew Paul, and we can, if we want to get into this later, we can, but like I did some work for him, like just like more so like assistant work, I guess, before I became a coach on the team. So you know, I remember when ProPhysique hired me as a coach, and I remember it was like I was surprised because I had thought that maybe they'd, that Paul or, the admin would give me like a set of like rules that I had to abide, by as a coach under the team. But I was pleasantly surprised that they kind of just like let me do my own thing. And I remember the first couple months of coaching, I was kind of like, "Whoa, okay, this is a lot of freedom, right?"
Mhm.
And especially when you're kind of just thrown into it, you have to quickly kind of adapt and find your coaching style. So I would say that specifically at the beginning, I used a lot of what I had learned from Paul because believe it or not, I remember before, like this was when I was in high school. I remember before I moved to Florida, I was watching Paul's YouTube videos in my bedroom. I remember I had discovered him. And so like I was, I had known about him and his philosophies well before I moved to Florida, well before I was, hired as a coach on the team. So I would say at the beginning, I definitely kind of just used what I had learned from him. But I find that over time, the more clients you coach, you just start to, and the more scenarios you deal with, the different types of personalities, you start to kind of, you adapt your niche and like your kind of set coaching style. So the way I look at it now is because I'm coached by Paul, right? So I see both sides. I know how he coaches and I know how I coach. And the way I kind of explain it now is and I tell my clients this all the time. I think I coach exactly how Paul coaches, except I think just personality wise, we're a little bit different, right? Obviously, I'm a female, he's a male, and there's always going to be differences there. Sometimes I'm a bit of a chatterbox, my check-in videos can be kind of lengthy, whereas his are a little bit more like, cut and dry and concise and straight to the point. So that's kind of the way I differentiate between maybe our coaching styles. It's just a differentiation in our personality, but as far as like our coaching philosophies, I would say they're pretty much the same.
That's super insightful. And something that I recognize about you is your commitment to working with coaches. And like I think this will come across as bias because I've actually been in your presence while you are coaching. Like we were chilling in your apartment community room and you're doing video check-ins and I'm like listening and kind of like not trying to eavesdrop, but I'm like getting a feel for how you handle situations and you definitely take your time with your clients. And I think that's a special thing. Maybe you could actually walk us through like what checking in with Coach Lexie is like, and also maybe talk about your community that you've built with Team Lexie.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that question. So I do video responses. So meaning I use a platform on my computer where I record myself, so you can see me and you can hear me, and that's how I do my client check-in responses. So my clients, we have a platform that they check in through. So on ProPhysique, we have like a check-in portal. It's really cool. It houses all the data, so clients can always go and look back at like previous check-ins. It's really awesome in that nature. But I get that, so I always get that, and it comes through my email. And all of my clients have, designated check-in days that they choose up front, but they all know what day they are expected to check in on. And so, typically, as long as I get their check-in within the time that the cutoff time, they'll hear back from me within the afternoon. But I will open up their check-in form, and then I will, kind of analyze that, evaluate that, and then I do my check-in response video. And I find that the video, one, it allows me to be a bit more like personable. Like it's just a lot more personable than getting a cut and dry email back, right? And I also find too that like my tone isn't misinterpreted, right? Whereas if I just type back a response to an email, nothing against, people that do that. I think it can work in some circumstances, but sometimes the tone can be misinterpreted, right? Like I know I'm somebody that if Paul sends me back a check-in and it just typed and there's no exclamation points, I'm like, oh my God, he's mad at me, right? When no, he's not mad at me. That's just the way, he's a guy. That's what he probably was gonna do. So I do video responses, and and the biggest thing that I feel like kind of explains my coaching style is, of course, I'm concerned with, okay, progress pictures, weight, macros, cardio, like the quantitative metrics, right? But I also really like to feed into the psyche of each client. I know, you'll appreciate that. And I think it's really important, to create a safe space for clients to feel like they can come to you and, hey, even if there's something that happens in their week that doesn't directly impact like their ability to hit their macros or their ability to get in their training, sometimes them just mentioning, hey, I went through a breakup this week. My stress was really high. I mean, knowing that can kind of give me some insight as a coach as to why maybe they're feeling the way they're feeling, why their body is responding the way it's responding, right? So those are other things I touch on in my check-in videos is, not only giving them the updated protocol, but hey, like, if stress was a big issue that week, let's talk about it. Let's talk about some things we can do the following week to really help with that stress management. Or if digestion was a really big struggle, let's talk about what that root cause could be and what we can kind of troubleshoot the week moving forward. Or, hey, maybe, I mean, sometimes I have to just give my clients pep talks as far as their mindset is not in a good spot. Sometimes I have to kind of give them a pep talk, and I always tell my clients, I always say, I am here to tell you what you need to hear, which may not always be what you want to hear in the moment, right? But it definitely will be something that probably further down the line you're going to thank me for, right? Because at the end of the day, why hire me if I'm just going to tell you everything you want to hear, so that's how the client check-in video responses work. So that's kind of how, like, I guess, check-ins with me in a nutshell.
And before we talk about your community, I want to backtrack onto something you said there, which is very important. That's getting to know the psyche of the client. And yes, I do appreciate that. Why do I appreciate that from a coach? Because usually a coach is the first point of contact where an athlete is opening up about something mental or life related going on outside of their physique. And it's when that connection can be made. That's where a coach can say, did you realize that stress can impact your physique? Did you realize when your nervous system is this way, it can have an effect on your body in this way? And I think making sure that the coach provides that type of opportunity for a client to express those things is really key. Otherwise, it can perpetuate an unfortunate side of this industry we sometimes see, which is, well, just sweep that under the rug. Don't worry about that right now. Don't focus on the breakup. Don't focus on the emotion. Don't focus on the life stress. It's like, okay, that is going to hit you like a freight train post show.
Oh yes, post show, absolutely. And that's like the same concept. And when girls want to do a prep because, like, oh, let's just say they're starting a prep and their relationship with food is not in a good spot. Well, prep, like, temporarily may kind of help with that, put a band-aid to it, but then it's like that is going to hit you like a freight train. Like you said, post show, it's going to come back even worse, right? And something you said there that, like, sparked a thought that I want to put out there real quick is, being like, when you are hiring a coach. So for anybody listening, whether you have a coach or you're looking for a coach, I always say it is so important to get on the phone with that coach before you hire them, right? Make sure it's going to be a good fit from just a personal standpoint, right? There's a lot of amazing coaches in this industry. And, like, that's why you have this coaches series. Like, all the coaches you're interviewing, we're all great coaches, but we all have something that's a little, unique to us, personality wise in particular. So I think when it comes to hiring a coach, don't be afraid to interview several coaches. I think it comes down to, you need to obviously trust your coach, but you want to make sure whoever you hire is somebody you feel very comfortable with, right? I always say, if you're not comfortable going to your coach with certain things, like, they may be a great coach, but that may not be the best coach for you, right? Because if I have a client who's just not comfortable telling me something like, hey, I went through a bad breakup and it's wreaking havoc on my stress and my sleep, or hey, I hate to admit this, but I did not hit my macros last night. I had a half a jar of peanut butter, right? Like, if you don't have that good relationship to the point where a client feels comfortable coming to you with those things, it can make the coaching client process really, hard, and ineffective at the end of the day. So I think that's one thing as a client you have to keep in mind when hiring a coach. Get on the phone with a prospective coach. And you know what? If personalities don't mesh, that doesn't mean it's a bad coach. It just probably means it's not a great fit for you.
That is such a great point, and that really hits on, yes, why I do the coach series, and also why I've been apprehensive to doing the coach series again, because people will interpret someone's personality or someone's coaching methodology in a different way than somebody else. So what's appealing to one might be horrific to somebody else. But my intention with this is exactly that: give you insight into the personality of the coach, give you insight into their coaching process, or how they view things. But ultimately, the decision is in your hands. And I think it's great when a coach can encourage you to interview interview coaches, make sure that you're asking questions. Like you may not work with any of the coaches I use on the series, but you can take all the questions and ask another coach. And that's something we should be encouraging. And it also maintains that same level of relationship versus a hierarchy of like, I'm the coach, you do what I say. It becomes like, okay, I'm your coach, you trust me. So I think that you already built a relationship where when I tell you something, you're going to not question it immediately because you've taken the time to understand that I have your best interests at heart.
Yes. Yeah. Key thing is like, coaching, it's a relationship. It's not a dictatorship. And I know some people prefer having a coach that's a little bit more like tough love, just tell me like it is, I don't need a ton of fluff. And that's for some people, but I think it is important to realize coaching is a relationship, right? It's not just a dictatorship.
That's right. So, while we're on the subject, what makes a coach a good coach?
Hmm. That's a great question. I feel like I could go so many different ways with this. I think one of the big things that, in my opinion, differentiates like an average coach from a really, really good, extraordinary coach is a coach that actually cares about the athlete as a person, right? I think in this industry, especially when, we're talking coaches who coach a lot of competitors, right? Myself included, sometimes it's easy to get wrapped up in just, okay, and like taking a client and getting them on stage to that first place, right? That's awesome and that is great. And then I think that's what we all want, right? But if we have to do that while compromising the client's mental health, life outside of bodybuilding, like, is it really worth it? Right. And so one of the things like I always try to do as a coach is, check up on my clients, like as a person every once in a while, right? Like, how are you doing outside of the gym, outside of your protocol? Like, how's life outside of this? And I know some coaches are like, I don't care about that stuff. But in my opinion, that is important when it comes to the clients long term with fulfilling the program we're doing, right? And so I think, in my opinion, a good coach really does take a care for their client as a person beyond just, okay, what did you weigh this week? What do your progress pictures look like? Are we moving in the right direction physique wise, right? So that's, in my personal opinion, I think what kind of differentiates between just like an average coach and maybe, an extraordinary coach.
That's a great point. No matter what, no matter what, coaching is being done, right? So regardless, you're receiving coaching, but it is maybe that attention to other areas of life. And I think that's really why me and you share a philosophy in that it's got to go deeper than the surface. And I've shared this before with some of the coaches already that I think it's unfortunate that there are coaches who will just like adopt that I'll do whatever it takes to get you or get me like more pro cards or more success. And then what happens is like, well, now where's their athletes now? Like that's a bit frustrating. Or people thinking then that you have to give up your life in order to be successful as a competitor when I actually think it's quite the opposite.
Yeah, and something else too that I think like you can pay attention to as an athlete when researching coaches and maybe looking for a good coach who has your best interest in mind, not only as an athlete but a person, is kind of what you just said, Celeste. Like, look at your athletes after the show, right? Like, look at their athletes post show, and also like maybe look at their client retention. I'm not saying that's everything, but I think that is kind of something that's important to look at. Are they just having clients that sign up with them and then leave after a couple months or whatever, or do they have clients that have been with them for a while, right? But I think specifically looking at a coach's athletes post show, that can definitely be some good telltale information for how that coach coaches that athlete during prep and sets them up for a successful post show. And I'm not saying like, you could be the best coach in the world, and not every client is going to have successful post show, right? But if you notice a direct trend with like a certain coach, their clients are always just kind of falling off post show, that's definitely some good insightful information to maybe collect.
Definitely. And I think of that not even just looking at them like physically, how do they look? It's like, what are the ways that they're talking about themselves? What are the ways they're talking about the sport? What's coming as a result of that? And I think that's a really actually a good opportunity now for me to ask you about your community because you have been able to maintain and build a great community. And I think that sets you apart. You're not just providing coaching under a Team Pro Physique
Yeah.
name, you've actually really crafted your own community through it. So why did you decide to build a community through your client base? And What is your goal with that?
Yeah, so that is a great question. And I know when I first started coaching, that was so there was another coach on the team. And she doesn't really coach much anymore, but she does more of like she's a director role. And I remember the first like company event we had, she had a lot of clients of her own there. And I remember kind of seeing like how they were all friends and how they had a little community. And I remember telling myself, okay, that's what I want one day, right? And even seeing like, Paul's clients and how, they all know each other. Maybe they don't like live, next to each other geographically speaking, but they talk on social media, right? I always knew I wanted that because one thing I have learned from being in this sport is that, and just, even if you're not a competitor, but like a lifestyle client, is this can sometimes be kind of like isolating, right? Most of the time, the people in our immediate life, our friends and our family, are not, competing, or they're not tracking their macros and living this lifestyle. So sometimes, in order to kind of fill that void and to not make it feel as isolating and lonely, I think it really does help to make those connections with other people who are also going through something similar, even if they don't, live next to you, even if it's just like a social media friend, right? That's how you and I started. So I really wanted that for my own clients, right? So it kind of started as like I just created like a group Facebook. I've had that for probably close to when I started coaching, right? And it kind of just started as a place where I would put out like information for my clients if they wanted it, just extra, resources. And I would say within the past year, oh my gosh, it has like completely done a 180 in the best way possible. Meaning, I've had many girls in there just say, "Oh my gosh, I'm so thankful for this group." I have girls that will just post in there occasionally if they're going through something kind of rough, and the fact that they feel comfortable enough to share that with the group of clients is so awesome, and it just goes to show that it's a safe space. And I've had girls that have met up like for coffee. I have some girls who are rooming together at the Arnold this upcoming year. So it's really just become such a neat community. And I think it goes back to, the root reason why I wanted that is I just feel like this sport can be isolating if you're by yourself, right? And if there's no one, like if you don't have somebody to talk to who's also doing it, right? So I think having that community, I mean, I think you can agree, like the friends we meet through competing and through doing this, like that's part of what makes this so special, So I really wanted to house that type of community for my clients, so they had that opportunity as well.
I could not agree more. I think it's important to create opportunities for people to connect in this sport because it can be isolating, like you said. And I've hosted many in person events because of this reason, bring people together to know it's okay to share those things. And I do the group calls through my community because I want people to know, like, you are not the only one going through this. And also, you can connect. And it's a really cool experience when you see not your, but when you see the community you've built turn into something like a friendship. Like I had these two girls who came to my very, very first event, and they're like best of friends now. They sat next to each other. They were quite quiet, but now they're besties.
Oh, I love that. Like that I know that sounds probably silly to people listening, but as a coach, like it makes me so happy. I had two girls a couple months ago that like they found out they live like within 30 minutes and they met up for coffee, and it's just like it's so cool. I love that. That stuff just makes me so happy to know that like through my coaching they are forming like potentially a lifelong friendship.
Right. And you know that then that person like already shares something with you. So you create common ground. And I know that Team ProPhysique does in-person events. We have been starting an annual event, pretty much me and you. But talk to us about the in-person events and seminars and why those are put together for athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is definitely something we've had like one or two a year for ProPhysique ever since I started working for the company, and they're changing a little bit every year as far as like who we're targeting, where we're having them at, all of that. But I'll just kind of speak. Broadly on like just seminars and workshops and things in general are something that I encourage my clients to seek and go to if they can as much as possible. And some of them, obviously, I know some seminars you have to pay to be a part of them, but there's also plenty of free seminars. But the reason I love being a part of these as much as I can, and the reason I encourage my clients to go to them is that's honestly I think what got me into this industry, and allowed me to meet the people I've met in this industry. Like when I moved to Florida originally, I didn't know anybody here. Like I didn't have any family, did not have any friends. And so essentially the way I kind of met people in this industry was I was the girl like going alone to I would go to shows even though I had no idea what was going on. I would go to little like expos, just walk around by myself and meet people. And so that's the beauty of like seminars and just in-person events. I think is yes, a lot of times it is uncomfortable going to them when you're newer to this industry or just even if you're like an introvert in general, but going to them is so valuable because you will meet some potential lifelong friends. You'll meet just some of the most amazing people. And that, like I said, a second ago, is half the fun of this sport is just the people you meet, right? Like if it weren't for this sport, you and I would have never met. And it's kind of cool to think about that. And I love meeting my clients in person too. Like that is just so much fun. Every time I meet a client in person, it's always like, it's funny because it's like, "Oh, wait, this is the first time we've met in person? Really?" 'Cause like, you talk to them so much, via phone, video calls, all that. You feel like you know them, and then you meet them in person, and it's just like it's the cherry on top.
That's so true. I think that's a really great point, to go and capitalize on these experiences and events and seminars and workshops and anything like that as an athlete. And now I'm going to ask you a kind of controversial question because I think it plays a role in this. Some people will say, that this is all just political, like it's for political reasons. This person only won because they did go to that, or they're speaking at this seminar because they're in with the judges or whatever. So what do you have to say to people who say politics with teams plays a role in their clients' placing, or that all of this is political?
Well, my first thought is if somebody in a sport really does think it is that political, then like why why are they competing? Like at the end of the day, nobody is forcing you to compete. If you truly believe it's politics and that you have no chance of doing well because you're not on a big team, then like nobody's forcing you to compete. Why are you doing it? Right? Like that's my tough love answer. But
Mhm.
I've talked to coaches before. Like I know Joe Pishkula really well too. I know Tim Gardner pretty well. And I recently just listened to a podcast with Sandy Williamson too that was great because they touched on the topic of politics. And I think what people don't realize is that the judges don't like half the time too when you are getting all glammed up and getting on stage like you don't look like your average like day-to-day self, right? The judges don't even really recognize people on stage anyways because like I know a lot of times when I get all glammed up people are like, oh my gosh, I didn't recognize you,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So there's that, but also I think pretty much every judge is going to say when they're judging athletes on stage, they don't have time first off to think about, oh, okay, this girl, oh, what team is she on? Like they don't have time, right? And they don't. I mean, they're smart, but they don't house all that information in their brain, right? They don't know which girl is from which team, and so that's part of it. And I also think too, people who really know how judging works knows that even if there was just one judge that was like biased, like they always drop those like the judging is always fair. That's why there's a big panel, right? So that's kind of my answer to the whole politics thing. Because it does get brought up, but I think you have to look at it with lay out that information that I just gave, and then really analyze. Okay, yeah, politics is probably just an excuse that a lot of people make because they don't want to admit like, oh, I didn't show up my best that day, that's why I didn't place the way I should have. A lot of people just kind of use politics if they don't want to admit to that.
Definitely agree. And while I'm not ever going to say that there's no way it's ever happened and all your experiences are invalid, I think most of the times though, like the NPC and the IFBB in particular does a really good job of preventing politics from playing a role in these things, and or biases from coming into the mix. So I love how you reminded people that the highs and lows get thrown out.
Yeah, it's important to realize, especially because I don't think that's something a lot of newer competitors really realize. But yeah, I mean, also too, like, follow local shows, follow pro shows, and it's not like the it's not like the athlete with the biggest social media following or the athlete on the biggest team is always winning, right? Like, I love,
Right.
I love sometimes looking at shows, looking at who won, and like looking at finding the athlete on Instagram and maybe they're like self-coached or maybe they come from a really small like team in Wyoming or whatever. Like I think that's always cool to see, but it
Same.
does happen, right? Like it's cool to see those instances because that just goes to show politics has absolutely nothing to do with it.
That's right. And if you don't take credit or responsibility for your losses, then you can't take credit and responsibility for your wins either. So if it's politics only when you lose, that's a problem, or if it's politics only when somebody else wins, I think that's problematic. So I like how you mentioned the taking responsibility, and I feel like that lends insight into what your answer might be here, but I'll ask, what do you think is the difference between a good athlete and then a phenomenal winning champion athlete?
Yeah. Oh, there's a lot of things. I would say like right off the get-go, something really simple. Two like coaching things would be the best athletes are always going to be the ones that are on it with their check-ins. Like the ones that aren't just going MIA randomly, for only checking in when convenient, right? I always say if you're only going to check in when it's convenient, like you're probably just going to get average results, right? So people who check in consistently, regardless of what type of week they're having, even if it's a week where it's kind of hard to check in, maybe they're busy or they're on a work trip, like when there is a will, like there is a way. That's the way I look at it. So clients who check in consistently, clients who are very open with me and don't gloss over the little details tend to do better when it comes to their stage look. But I also think that mindset is just huge. I notice a direct correlation with those who have more of that glass half full mindset and like, how can I be better mindset, tend to always do better on stage, but also appreciate the process a lot more, right? Whereas those who have that kind of glass half empty mindset and they're always just looking at their flaws and all the negatives, they tend to not only not do as good on stage but just not enjoy the journey as much, right? So I really appreciate a good athlete who has a positive mindset. And I think another big thing is, as an athlete, realizing that, like, okay, yes, winning is amazing, we all want to do that, right? Whether we want to admit it or not, I think getting first place, winning an overall is always the goal. But the having more so the goal of just beating your past version of yourself, I think that also makes a really good athlete. Is just going into something, knowing, okay, I just want to, regardless of the placing, because we can't control who shows up, I just want to beat the previous version of myself that was on stage last time. I think that also makes a really good athlete.
Those are such great points. And what I like about those points is that they are actually something you can build in yourself. So if you're listening to this and you're like, I haven't been consistent, good news is your check ins tomorrow and you haven't checked in 3 months, submit it. Doesn't matter. Make it happen today. Everything that you pointed out. Okay, you fixate on the flaws. Guess what? You can fix that. Let's start focusing on the positive. So everything you shared, what I value about that is that it also provides insight into what you can do differently. Now, I think when people, you mentioned first time competitors, I think when people come into the sport, there's also misconceptions. So, what are some of those common misconceptions that people have about this sport when they come to you or are considering doing bodybuilding?
Yeah, so okay, so the first thing I can think of off the top of my head, and I think this is a message I have been preaching a lot more recently, like just the time, because of the time of year. It's January, a lot of people are wanting to do something new, is that competing for a bodybuilding show is not just like your next fad diet, right? It's not just, oh, okay, I want to lose these 20 pounds, or I want to look a certain way. I'm gonna do a bodybuilding prep, right? In my opinion, you can do that, but it may not be super successful. In my opinion, competing is kind of an extension of already being an athlete. It's a way of like, okay, you're already an athlete, you're already going to the gym, fueling your body, living that lifestyle, and bodybuilding or competing in a bodybuilding show, in my opinion, is just a way to kind of take things to the next level there, right? Like it's not something that you just, okay, you go from not working out, not tracking your food, to all of a sudden, okay, I want to get into shape. I'm going to do a bodybuilding competition. So I think that's something that a lot of people need to recognize. And I think another thing to recognize too that is kind of a misconception amongst first time competitors is it's not as simple as just, okay, I'm going to reach out to this coach because there's this show I want to do in 10 weeks, right? I'm going to hire a coach for the prep and they're going to get me through the prep. And then afterwards, I'm going to just kind of, I'll go off on my own and go back to normal again. Again, can you do that? Yeah, but is that optimal? Not at all, right? So I think that looking at it as more of like a long-term process as opposed opposed to, oh, okay, there's a show in 10 weeks. I'm going to hire this coach. We're going to do it in 10 weeks and it's going to be awesome. Cuz sometimes I'll have girls on the phone that are interested in competing, and and we'll talk a little bit about where they're currently at, what their habits look like, how much food they're eating, what their maintenance is like, and we'll come to find out, oh, okay, we need to do a little bit of like reverse diet work, get their metabolism in a bit of a better spot before we start a prep and are able to be successful, right? Or, sometimes we'll decide, hey, we need to put on a little bit more muscle before we start a prep and we're successful at it. So I think a common misconception is that it's like a shorter term kind of just challenge. Whereas if you really want to be optimal and successful at this sport, like let's say your goal is, I want to win an overall, I want to be a pro one day, you have to look at it from more of like a zoomed out lens, and realize it's definitely like, everybody says it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So I think that's something that is really important to get across. So, and then the last thing I will say, I think a lot of first time competitors underestimate how tough posing can be. So I think that's another thing that in my opinion, you should be practicing posing well before you start a contest prep if you want it to be fluid and just look super natural by the time you get to stage.
I'm really glad that you brought that aspect up too, because that's something you are great at and you focus on with your clients and you also post about. And you have a great YouTube presence where you share a lot of these insights for both first time competitors and those who have been in the sport, as well as your own journey, which I think is great because I do value when coaches have experience with bodybuilding. Doesn't mean they had to compete or that they have to be a pro or they have to be competing actively, but I do think having that passion, that's more so what I'm referring to. So when you see a coach who has a passion about competing and takes the time to understand it, I think that's a very special thing. And you said something that stood out to me, which was the word optimal. What does it mean? Well, actually, hold on. Let me go back and affirm also. I love how you mentioned it can't just be a 10-week prep. If you're committing to a prep or a sport like this, you should consider, if I'm prepping for 10 weeks, I should at least work with my coach for 10 weeks after that. At least, and maybe even 10 weeks before, at least. Because if you're in this sport, like one of my pet peeves is I'm going to do this show, but like you said, they've never lived the lifestyle. And then it's like, okay, well, hey, I think you'd be better off doing a building phase and then stepping on stage and then reversing out of it. Then it's like, never mind, I don't want to do it. It's like, then what did you really want? What was it that you were really looking for? Because with bodybuilding, you have to be in it for the long haul, whether that's a one-time competitor or it's a Olympian.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, I think one of the biggest success hacks for anybody listening, like if you want to be successful in this sport, you have to be able to practice that delayed gratification. Because I think that's what it comes down to. When a client gets on the phone and they talk to a coach and they want to prep and then do a show in 12 weeks, and the coach says, hey, I don't think that's going to be smart. We need to do probably at least a couple of months of like building and reverse dieting. And that's not always easy to hear, right? But you have to really tap into that delayed gratification if you want to be successful and optimal when it comes to this sport. Because, like, again, I use the word optimal because you can do anything you want, right? Like, anybody listening could prep for a show or do a show in 5 weeks if they wanted, right? But it's a matter of, is it going to be optimal and are you going to end up your best on stage? That's what it comes down to.
Beautiful. That's exactly right. Like, there's many ways to get to the end result, but how happy will you be with that process and with yourself, and how far are you willing to go against potentially your own values or health to get that result? And I wish I could go back in time to my beginner competing self and be like, hey, you did your show, really proud of you. Let's just build for the next like 3 years. Because I honestly think, like, now I look back and I'm like, dang, if I had just been told, because I did what I was told. If I had just been told, hey, take 2 years off, I'm telling you it's going to be your best bet, I would have done it. But instead I went on did more and more and more shows, and it was the same thing. Grow, grow, grow. Well, why are we still competing then?
Right, right. It's a very hard pill to swallow as a competitor. It is. And the way I look at it is, think about how quickly. So like obviously we're just right into 2024 when we're recording this. I don't know when it'll come out, but we're just into 2024. And I'd say think of how quickly 2023, like that year just flew by. Like it was so quick. So think about, if your coach is telling you, hey, I think you could really benefit from taking, 6 months to a year off to grow. I know that's a hard pill to swallow as an athlete because that seems like such a long time, right? But if you think about how quickly 2023 like flew by, like put that into perspective and realize, okay, ooh, 6 to 12 months, like honestly, it's gonna fly by. It's gonna go by a lot faster than I kind of think it will right off the get-go.
True. The time will pass anyways, whether you're in a deficit or you're in a surplus trying to build. Like the time is going to pass. You're going to have to invest it anyways.
Absolutely. And you are not any less of a bodybuilder or a competitor just because you're not in prep. I think that's why a lot of girls struggle too. Like you are still, I mean, if anything, you're more of a bodybuilder when you're not in prep because that's truly when you're building your body, right? And I always encourage my girls to stay as involved in the industry as possible when they're not prepping. That's a great way to still feel like you're involved and excited about things, right? And to kind of negate some of those post-show blues, volunteer at shows, be the trophy girl, volunteer at check-ins, or even if you don't want to do that, go to shows, just watch or go to seminars, right? That's a great way to still stay involved even though you're not actively in prep.
Definitely. Well, let's go back to the point of optimal because I think a lot of people do think that prep equates to potentially ruining your physical and mental health. And me and you agree on those points. So I kind of want to hear more. So, like, when you say there's an optimal way to prep to perform well and keep your long-term health, what does that look like in application when you're coaching somebody?
Yeah, so yeah, I think that stereotype that prep is going to ruin your life or ruin your health, like I think that's old news because I mean that definitely can happen, right? But you have to be smart. You have to do your research, and this goes back to what we just said. If a coach tells you you're not in a spot to start prep, that's probably because they're looking out for your long term health, right? Because I noticed that there's like a direct correlation between clients that have a very successful post show and actually enjoy competing and it doesn't wreak havoc on their relationship with food and their body image too much are typically the people that work really hard to be in an optimal spot before they start prep, right? And what does that look like to me as a coach? Well, that looks like, okay, before somebody starts prep, their relationship with food needs to be good. I don't want it to, I don't want them to be struggling with, binging or, restriction or, anything like that. So their relationship with food needs to be pretty good. Their body image needs to be in a good spot. Now, hey, I get it. We all, especially as females, like we have our days, right? I'm not saying that, but I'm talking about like you need to have a pretty good like positive look at yourself when it comes to body image. So those two things I think are really important. But I think also, something else that's really important for making sure you have a optimal prep that doesn't allow you to have these long-term health repercussions is considering how much food are you eating before you start prep and how much cardio are you doing. And I think this is kind of goes back to a couple minutes ago when you asked me about a common misconception amongst first-time competitors is I know I didn't think about this when I started my first prep. Like I didn't think about how much food I was eating to maintain and how much cardio I was doing, right? But at the end of the day, like you have to think about it this way. As a coach, we primarily have two kind of quote unquote tools in our toolbox to get an athlete stage lean. And that's going to be taking from their food, putting them in a calorie deficit, and then adding to their cardio, right? So if I get a client who has, let's say, 15 to 20 pounds to drop in a prep and they're already doing a lot of cardio and not eating very much, well, that means we're probably going to have to dive really deep with their calories, really high with their cardio to get them stage lean. Now, that's not always the case. Sometimes people just have, unique bodies and we have to get kind of extreme regardless of their starting circumstances. But the best way to negate not having to get so uncomfortably extreme deep into a prep is to make sure that you're starting your prep with an optimal maintenance calorie range and an optimal cardio maintenance, right? Because that's where, like, if you just don't start prep in an optimal spot with those things, that's where it can get to some really unhealthy extremes at the end of prep, in order to get you stage lean.
And sometimes we learn that the hard way, and then we realize, like, shoot, now I see the benefit of that reverse and of that post show and of that building. I also appreciate how you said you're not any less of a competitor just because you're not in prep. That's a really strong mental struggle we see in people. And you talked about your approach in different scenarios too. So I'm going to ask you this hypothetical question, which is your client comes to you and says, Lexie, I rebounded. They haven't checked in, you haven't been able to monitor it. I've rebounded after my show and I just want to reverse it and get back to normal. What do you do?
Yeah, so this I mean this has happened before. I think every coach who's been around for long enough and coaches competitors has probably had this scenario. So I think that typically the first thing I do is say, let's hop on a call because more oftentimes than not, that always solves everything. Because I always say, like, some clients, they act out of like emotion as opposed to logic, right? And they make decisions out of that emotional state rather than that logical state. So a lot of times, if I can get the client on the phone and we can just talk through things and I can kind of talk some sense into the logic, it can really help. But a lot of times, this happens, especially with first time competitors. They don't quite know what to expect post show, and then, oh my gosh, crap, a couple days goes by and they realize, oh my god, I've completely ruined my reverse, when really, okay, they probably haven't ruined the reverse, but if you think you've ruined your reverse and then you have that all or nothing mentality of like, oh, okay, well, I've done really bad these first 3 days. I've ruined it. Now, what's the point, right? Like that's not a good mindset to have either. So I always, always, always say, hey, let's hop on the phone. And then usually what I like to do with clients in that scenario is I always preface and say, hey, like you're probably holding on to a lot of water weight, right? A lot of clients think if, let's just say, their first week post show, they completely fall off the weight side, their weight is up 5, 6, 7 pounds. They think, oh my God, I need to go back to a deep deficit to get that weight off. But really, usually what it comes down to is just consistency with hitting their actual macros, consistency with their foods, making sure they're going back to eating the foods that they were eating in prep, right? Because you can't reintroduce too much newness right off the get go. A lot of times it just hones into, okay, let's establish a consistent routine. That's going to allow you to drop that water weight, right? You didn't ruin your reverse, but you are holding on to some water weight, and consistency is going to help that to come off, right? So usually we talk about that on the phone call. And then also, I'm really big on when I have a client who wraps up their season, because that's typically when you see people maybe falling off. It's different if, like, they know, okay, oh, I competed at this show, but I have another show in 2 or 3 weeks, right? Usually you don't see a big issue when that's the case, but it's when, okay, ooh, I just competed. This was my last show of the season. Now I know I'm going into a big, big long off season. That's when the struggle happens, right? So I always do my best to schedule calls with all my clients after their season ends to establish some good goals outside of shows, right? Because I find that if you can establish those goals right after somebody's show, it helps them to kind of shift gears and to feel like they have something new that they're working towards. I find that the root cause of why a lot of competitors kind of get into that post show blue state, or they fall off track post show, is because it's like, oh my god, okay, now what? I have nothing that I'm working towards, right? So if you can set those clear cut goals even before you end your season, I think it can be really helpful. And I'm not just talking about goals in the gym or goals with like your food, but even goals like outside of that, like, with relationships, with your career, with maybe some hobbies. I've had clients before say, hey, I really want to get back into powerlifting. And so, like, that's a goal we set, in their off season. So I think establishing those goals right after your show or your season wraps up is a good way to kind of give you something else that you feel like you're working towards. And it can help you to not fall off so hardcore as if, in comparison, if you have nothing set in stone for goals after your show.
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I think it's worth mentioning too, that I imagine as a coach, there's times where a client's like, well, to mitigate gaining excess fat, I want to now start running marathons. And you're like, well, do you want to compete in a year? Because so talk to us about a scenario like that. Like, how do you as a coach also maintain, like, if you want to compete at that level, like there are certain things you might have to not consider.
Yeah, this is a great one, because I actually do have a few athletes. I think I have two in particular right now, two that are into CrossFit. They're actually CrossFit instructors, so it's a little bit harder too because it's like it's part of their job, right? And I have I've had a couple clients, and I have a couple now that like are spin instructors, right? So it's kind of different when it's part of their job, right? Because like, who am I to sit here as a coach and say, quit your job? Like, I can't do that. So typically, if it's a matter of like it is part of their job, we have to kind of talk and and I'll always give them the heads up, right? Of like, hey, especially like with my two CrossFit ladies now that like are instructors, we're not quite in prep yet, but we're kind of in that pre-prep stage. And I've had the talk with them of like, hey, here's, what we're going to really have to pay close attention to in prep is, we're going to have to really pay close attention to your recovery and, and how we can manage, CrossFit and kind of doing that like bare minimum at the end, right? Because like I don't want you doing all that CrossFit at the end of prep when your body is not going to be in a spot to recover from it, right? So I have that conversation up front up front with those types of people. Now, when it comes to people that just like let's just say they like running or they like spinning, right? It's not their job, but they just like doing it. Typically, I have that conversation, the same conversation with them of like, hey, I know you like doing this, but here's why this isn't going to be beneficial for us long term, right? You always have to kind of talk some sense into clients when it comes into the long term, right? Because you have to kind of zoom out, and that's hard to do as an athlete on your own, to zoom out and really look at the big picture, right? So I always, if I have a client who loves running, I'll have that conversation with them of how the running, we can incorporate a little bit of running. I want them to at least, have some sort of enjoyment within their protocol, but whether it's a prep or it's their off season, if it's their off season, I'll say, hey, this is not going to be super conducive to what our goal is to build muscle. We can do running, but just realize it's not really going to help us. It's going to kind of potentially hold us back or and mean we need some, a longer building season, or it's just going to kind of keep things the same, right? It's like, do you really want that? And usually their answer is, okay, yeah, not really. I understand why I can't run all the time. And then especially too in prep, my clients usually by the end of prep, they understand, ooh, and they don't even want to try to endeavor like the running or the hardcore cycle classes because they realize the importance of recovery and why that can be so important towards the end of prep.
Yeah, that education piece is so important, and making sure the client is in that healthy spot from the start, it sounds like is very important to you. So, what are you personally looking out for when it comes to making your client's health a priority, and how are you doing that?
Yeah, so I guess, the initial consult call that I have with all clients is super important for me to really just to get to know them as an athlete. Not only, the quantitative metrics such as like, okay, what's your weight? What do your pictures look like, measurements, but also to get to know them a little bit and kind of dig into that psyche and see mentally, are they in a good spot to start prep? How are they talking about food? How are they talking about themselves, right? And even like what is their why behind wanting to get into competing? So I think that's a good one to as a coach to consider. If an athlete's why for wanting to compete is like, oh, I went or I see this girl at my gym competing and she looks really shredded and cool. Like that's why I want to compete. Okay, like let's maybe dig a little bit deeper and find that deep rooted why, right? Make sure you're in this for the right reasons. So I think talking to a client, whether it's that initial consult call or having a phone call with a client before we pull the trigger and start prep and just making sure mentally they're in a good spot. I think that is super, super key, but also like throughout a prepping process, if we're noticing that a client, like if there's some red flags such as just internal health potential red flags, right? Like obviously I am not I'm not a physician, right? I'm not, that's not my scope. But as a coach, I do, there are things I know are red flags, right? Internal health red flags, right? So if I ever suspect any of those, I will bring them up with the client, and usually, we'll either consult with a doctor, or we'll get their blood work and we'll take action in that way. But usually, if any of that stuff is happening before a prep or in a building phase, I always tell my clients, like health wise, internally, we need to be in a really good spot before starting prep, because if not, prep is probably only going to make the issues worse, right? Like there's very rare instances where prep can actually improve your, your internal health
Mhm.
markers, right? So if you're starting prep and your thyroid is, for example, like really, really awful, you're probably not going to see it improve much in prep. So like you kind of have to take your baseline, internal health markers where they're at before you start prep and realize they're probably either going to stay the same or get a little worse throughout prep, right? So you want to be starting in that, an opt as in as optimal of a spot as you can with that stuff.
That's a great point. Now, I want to shift gears a little and hear about coaching and its effect on you, because I always like to hear from the coaches like more of their side of things. I think it provides some more empathy and understanding that you are a person, not just a coach for yourself, right? So, what kind of mental, physical, and even emotional tolls does competing, or does coaching take on you, and how do you handle those types of demands?
Yeah, so I will always say that being a coach, specifically like coaching more and more competitors, because I am a competitor myself, I will 100% say being a coach has made me a better athlete, and also vice versa. I think being an athlete has made me a better coach because I'm able to empathize with my clients in that way, right? Like I've even had clients tell me before, gosh, I'm so happy like you're going to be in prep when I'm in prep, and I'm so happy to know like you're going through it too, right? But I would say, you know, did you ask you did you wait, can you repeat the question? You said were there any hurdles that like I experienced through coaching?
Basically, like those mental, physical, and emotional tolls that coaching can take on you and how you handle those.
Absolutely. So this is definitely, still a work in progress because I feel like I am somebody that, and I think you and I are very similar in that sense. We would work 7 days a week, 24 hours if we needed to, right? Like I mean, there still are. There are times where I will literally lose sleep, or like I won't be able to go to sleep thinking I'm like, oh my gosh, crap. Like I was supposed to get that program to this person today, or I was supposed to, I didn't respond to their email that came through, later this afternoon, and I'll like get up and want to respond to it. So I think boundaries as a coach, it's been very important for me to realize that like I need to eat my own words, because I always tell my clients, you can't you have to fill up your own cup before you can be the best to those around you, right? So I have to kind of look at it in the same sense of like, okay, it is important for me to have like Saturdays are my days where I don't have any check-ins. That's kind of my day where I take off of work and I just kind of mentally reset, right? And that really helps me to not feel burnt out, right? And to show up as my best self for my clients. And you and I were just discussing before before we started this podcast that I'm going to be actually taking like the first vacation I've and like couple days off that I've ever taken since I started coaching next week. And I said that was kind of scary for me because I had never done it before, but I know it is so important for me to do that because, as humans, we are not robots, right? Like we cannot go 365 days out of the year without, kind of burning out a little bit. And sometimes it happens without even realizing it. So having those boundaries for myself has been really important. And then, also having those boundaries with not only myself and like my working hours, but also my clients, right? With like knowing, okay, hey, like let's keep things, please respect like my business hours, right? If you're gonna text me at 9 p.m., like okay, but don't expect a response until probably the next day because I'm kind of a grandma and I'm a sucker with my sleep. And so having those boundaries, I think, has been the biggest thing for me. And I think what time oftentimes people don't think about is coaching, and I know that you probably experience this a lot, Celeste, with the nature of your work, but it can be, I mean, it can be a lot like mentally, because you're dealing with a lot of people in their different emotions. And sometimes, I mean, for some of my clients, like I'm their only like person that they can really talk to, right? And I don't take that lightly. So it can be a big like mental toll. I'm not saying in a bad way by any means, but just it's a lot where it does become very important to have your boundaries and to make sure you are taking care of yourself as a coach. That way you can show up as your best self to your athletes.
Yes. And you mentioned, the cruise, and I'm so happy for you, and I'm glad that you're doing that. And I know you said most of your clients are really happy too. It's so crazy because like I've been running my business since 2015, and I don't think I've ever not not I don't even know how I would manage that. And but then again, I learned I needed to set some boundaries because I would if I respond immediately to a client every time they have a need, I'm actually perpetuating a reliance on me, and I don't want that. So that helped me transform how I approach it. And also, I used to be like, I'm always going to respond within 24 hours because that's just what I was doing. But I'm not a coach doing a check-in once a week, responding in 24 hours to a person. I'm literally reviewing people's entries every single day. And it's like the amount of work I do with my clients is very deep, you guys. So I was demanding of myself to do it within 24 hours. My business was growing. And I was like, you know what? Instead of raising my prices after getting this degree, I'm going to actually lower my response times because of how in depth I go. So now I'll respond within 48 hours, but you can reach out with an emergency or something urgent anytime, obviously, if that's the package you sign up for. However, like you said, sometimes I will respond at 11 p.m. at night, okay? I'm guilty
But you know
as
what? I feel like opposites. I'm such a grandma with my sleep, and I feel like you are more of a night owl.
So it's interesting you say that too, because like I used to, it depends on life circumstances. Like in prep, when I have to be up at like when I was doing the counseling degree and prep and business, and I was like up at 3 a.m., but like nowadays, like I'll stay up late, do my work. Like I kind of just go with the flow based on how my body feels because of how like this I had to be for that phase. I feel like now I'm in a phase of like, okay, like I have my structure, but I take the time. So I really like how you said that how you handle those demands, how you've learned boundaries, how you're taking that time. Something I think I should ask you is some of these hypothetical round
Yeah, let's
questions. So if I am 1 year into competing with a few overall wins under my belt, so I'm doing freaking good for my first year.
yeah.
And my goal is to get my pro card. And I've not yet stepped on a national stage. And I've been working with the same coach for for all that time, for all those shows. But now I'm looking for a new approach. Why would I hire you?
Okay, so yeah, this is a great question. So typically, first off, I'm gonna like theorize that this athlete, let's just say they scheduled a consult call with me and they're trying to find out more about my coaching. So I think first, I respect every other coach in this industry, and I think I'd first have to kind of ask, like, hey, gosh, you've been with a coach. They've led you to a couple of overalls. I mean, it's on paper, it seems like you guys are doing pretty darn good, right? But I think I'd want to dig a little bit deeper as to why this athlete wanted a different approach, right? Because essentially, what I think a lot of athletes don't realize is every time you're hiring a new coach, you're not okay. I don't want to say you're starting over like as an athlete, but you're kind of starting over in a sense of like this new coach is kind of having to learn you from the ground up, right? Whereas, you've worked with a coach previously for a year or 2 years, they know you so well, right? Now, that is not me saying like you can't ever change coaches, because if it is a toxic scenario or relationship, like absolutely change coaches. So I think I'd want to understand a bit more why this client was wanting a new approach, right? And kind of respect their former coach from that standpoint. And then if it was for a logical reason, if the reason like they wanted to try a new approach was for a valid reason, I think, we would definitely go from there. But I think I'd want to respect their former coach first and really figure out, okay, why do you want a new approach? Is it just something really silly? Or is it's something that's actually really logical?
Yeah, and we've run into a circumstance or multiple like that, not that exact one, where you'll have inquiries and I have an understanding of that client too, and we get to discuss and share like, hey, what's going on? And I get to talk to that client directly. You get to talk to that client and still maintain respect for who it is they're working with and understand that there's so many things that go into that. I think it would be really odd if a coach, and now I'll say this, and I hope no one actually answers it this way because I will eat my words, but like I think it would be odd if a coach was like, oh, well, like, yeah, I would just take you on because I think there's so much more to it. And I think most people would say what you said. Now, here's my next one. If I'm 4 weeks out from a show, and I keep saying, and I'm your client, and I keep saying I don't feel ready, but you believe that I am. What's your response?
Oh gosh, this happens all the time too. Because, well, first off, I always tell my clients, right off the get go, I'm like, you hire me because you trust me, right? And realize if you trust me, I'm not going to put you on stage if you're not ready, right? That is a big thing. Like I've had this conversation multiple times with clients before of like, hey, I don't think we're going to be ready or at your all time best for a show. So let's consider doing this show instead, right? Like I am not afraid to have that conversation, right? But typically, what happens is deep into prep, and we all know this if you've been in prep for, we get those goggles, right? You do not see yourself clearly. I like to kind of explain it as if like you see yourself with very like foggy goggles. That's how you kind of see yourself. So you have to take what you see with a grain of salt. Like I cannot tell you how many times like now I'll look back at pictures when I was in peak week and I'm like, oh my God, I was so lean. But at the time, you don't realize it. So I always have to have that conversation with my girls of like, okay, trust me, I would not put you on stage if you were not going to be ready. And I always say, second off, like you have to realize your prep goggles are really intense right now. And another thing I have found myself sometimes having to explain to clients is like, specifically because I coach mainly bikini competitors, is bikini is not just a contest of who's the leanest, right? Some girls get so fixated in like, I need to be the leanest, I need to be the most shredded, I need to have the most vascularity. And I say, go talk to Sandy Williamson, or a pro judge, and ask them what they're looking for in bikini. That they're not looking for the leanest girl on stage, right? It's all about that full, round, bubbly muscle. And especially like for a first time competitor, sometimes they don't realize that. So as a coach, it's my job to educate them about that. And so that's something I'll talk about sometimes with people, is if I know they're like definitely as lean as they need to be, and I know that, I'll have to have the conversation of like, hey, remember, bikini is not just a contest of who's the leanest, who's the most shredded. Like, it's supposed to exude health and femininity in quotations. I think that's what it says on the NPC website. So it's not always just about being the most striated or leanest. Like, you got to have some fullness and oomph to that muscle.
Totally. And we hear the judges consistently drive this point home. And I got to say, unfortunately, sometimes I think athletes are bringing to the stage a look that is not necessarily what they're looking for, but it ends up being the best that day because everyone brought their hardest package. So now what's being rewarded? Like the best of all of those. So it makes it
That's a good point.
right. It's like almost perpetuating that.
It is, because there are so many girls, and I'll be honest, when I first got into the sport, I thought the same thing. But again, this just comes with learning more and more, and evolving with the sport, going to shows and just being a student of it. But some people will say, oh, they rewarded a hard look at that show, or oh, those judges like more of a soft look. But again, it goes back to what's there that day. Like, the judges can only judge what's there that day. So like, let's say you do get a lineup of girls and no one is really super like, full round and bubbly, everybody's a little bit leaner, well, they're probably gonna, reward a leaner girl, right? So it all just depends on who shows up that day. And so that's why I think some people think like, oh, some judges prefer this, some judges prefer that. But it really just comes down to what is, what shows up that day.
I think it's great that you emphasize that it's not a vascularity conditioning contest. Sandy literally just said in that, I think you're referring to the bikini and the brain and her,
Yes.
yeah,
That
she was,
was a good episode.
yeah, I'm only like halfway through right now, but she said that, they were basically talking about how Instagram can make it seem like it's one way and it's not, or she'll, notice it'll look different show to show. Even herself as a judge providing feedback can see that. So I think it's important to strive for your best and know that that's enough. But also, like, when you aren't feeling lean enough and you have a coach who's telling you, like, if we get you leaner, now your upper body is like this and your lower body is like this.
Uh,
It, like, I know for me, like, my legs can look dense and my upper body doesn't look big enough, so I need to grow my upper body. But what's better is to have balance in bikini than it is to have, oh, your legs are super tight and your glutes are popping, but your upper looks tiny.
yeah, balance is key. I always say everything on a bikini physique should kind of like, everything should be good. There shouldn't just be one thing that's great, right? Like, if you look at a bikini competitor on stage who's doing really well, like, you should not just directly be like targeted towards one muscle group. Like, it's really cool if somebody has really great glutes or really awesome capped shoulders, but that's not bikini. Like, after all, bikini, it's a certain criteria, right? They want everything to be very balanced, which usually means everything should kind of be good, not just one thing should be super dominant and great to the eye.
So let me ask you, what do you think is the most overlooked component of bikini athletes for success in the sport?
The most overlooked component, ooh, I think I think two things, and I think they could kind of go hand in hand. I think going back to that post show, I think that's very overlooked, especially if you're a newer competitor in the sport. Like, I don't think a lot of newer competitors really think about that post show, right? They don't think about the after the show. They just think about everything up until the show. So I think that's very overlooked. And I also think the mental health side of things with competing is very overlooked, and that's why I'm so grateful like to have somebody like you in this industry that I can refer my clients to if I feel like, okay, I can, I can give them as much as I can possibly give them as a coach, but maybe if they need somebody who's a little bit more skilled in the psychology in particular, I can send them to you, because I think mental health is very overlooked in this sport. In my opinion, you can't have the physical results without the mental piece of it first. Like, the mental health is always what you have to focus on first, because the physical, usually the physical part will come as a byproduct if the mental health is in a really good spot.
Well, I appreciate that, and I definitely agree, and that was a big reason why I had reached out to Sandy about the women's workshop, and I was like, "Can I please contribute? Like, this is a missing piece," and she's, like, so excited about it, you
I'm
know?
so glad that you bring up because I mean, I think, and we could go down a whole rabbit hole on this like another time, but like mental health in general is something that is so undervalued. And I think a lot of it stems from people just being afraid to speak up if they're struggling, you know? But I think it's so powerful when somebody can admit and be self aware enough to say, hey, I struggle with this. I'm going to reach out for help and kind of bite the bullet rather than ignore that and then let it become an actual issue that becomes really, really hard to fix in the long term.
Yeah, and we don't have to go down that rabbit hole now, and you guys, we did a YouTube video together in the past that kind of briefly touched on this, on
Oh, yeah.
Lexie's.
Mhm.
Yeah, so something I will say to that point, though, is I think a lot of people avoid the mental health side because they see it as a threat to their physical results versus an asset. They think that by taking the time to treat it, it'll serve as a distraction versus a benefit. So I like that that's something you encourage your clients to do. Now I'm gonna go into the rapid fire round.
Okay, cool.
Um, one sentence or less. However, if you're like, nah, I really want to expand on it, I'm telling you right now, every coach has already expanded on it. So it's, I don't know why I preface rapid fire in that sense. So do you believe in using waist trainers?
Um, yes. Oh, I'm gonna be the worst at this. Yes and no. I think yes and no. We can come back to that if we want.
Okay. If it fits your macros or a structured meal plan.
So macros, but specifically if you are in prep, making your own customized meal plan based off of the macros.
Nice. And do you believe in fasted cardio?
Again, this is gonna be a yes and no, and I can come back to that and make it short and sweet if you want to hear my elaboration.
Okay. And are you a fan of water cutting?
No.
And steady state or high intensity interval training specifically for fat loss and maintaining fullness in the glutes.
Steady state for sure.
Okay, which of those or what of those do you want to expand on? Because I think there were some that would have been really nice to hear some expansion.
Yeah, so I can start, and I'll start with the two that I kind of wanted to expand on my yes and no. So the waist trainer, the way I look at it is they're not. It's not a magical tool. It's not like it's gonna shrink your waist. However, I find that it can be beneficial for bikini athletes that struggle maybe with their posture or core control. Right? It kind of lives up to its name in a sense of like it can kind of train your waist, you know, to and help you to have better core control, which can transpire into better posing. Right? However, it's not something I require all of my athletes to wear, but it's definitely not something I am against. Now, the other thing I wanted to kind of allude on is the fasted cardio. So, there is like scientifically, like there's really not a huge pro to doing fasted cardio as opposed to fed cardio, right? When it comes to like which one burns more fat. However, like I know personally, I love fasted cardio because I kind of compare it to like it's the making the bed of the fitness industry because there's that old saying of like people who make their bed in the morning are like more productive throughout the day. And I'll tell you, when I'm doing fasted cardio, like that's the way I set the tone for my day. Like I am just usually a lot more like I'm a lot more positively influenced with things I'm doing throughout the day. So if I have an athlete and like that's the scenario with them, oh my gosh, heck yes, please do fasted cardio. But you know, like when I have a client who gets deeper into prep and maybe their cardio is higher, you know, and they need to maybe split it up into two sessions, you know, I'm not going to have them do their whole cardio duration for fasted. Maybe do half of it for fasted, but that's again something I don't require all my athletes to do because it's again scientifically one doesn't burn more fat than the other, really. So it kind of just comes down to a personal preference.
Now, I did want to hear more on your personal take because you said with macros, you said that in prep you believe in having like a structured meal plan that you create based upon your macros. So, what's the reasoning for that? And are there any health impact or maybe, health impact or benefits to a macro plan versus a meal plan and how that can affect you?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to the health impacts, it's more so the mental health that impacts. I will say I notice that most girls that actually are given macros for prep tend to have a much better post-show experience, right? Whereas girls who are given a meal plan, they can only eat, the same 5, 6 foods for 6 months. They typically, by the time they compete, those are the same people that have a ton of hoarded treats that they go after, and that's where the slippery slope, ends up happening. So although meal plans can work and get somebody stage lean, it's about, going back to what we said earlier, thinking, kind of zooming out and thinking about the long term, thinking about the post show, right? And so with my athletes, like I said, I think that the macros have more of a beneficial side when it comes to the mental health of thing or mental health side of things, but also it can definitely, I think macros can be beneficial from like a micronutrient standpoint, because sometimes what happens with meal plans is, if you're only eating like the same food sources for too long of a period of time, you can develop some different micronutrient deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, all those types of things, right? You can also maybe develop some food aversions from just limiting yourself for so long. So that's why I like to give my clients macros. And then I highly recommend to kind of create a meal plan week to week based off of the macros I give them, focusing on like 90-ish% of that food coming from whole food.
That's a really great way of looking at it. It's like macros can be beneficial because you're able to incorporate any and all foods, and you won't necessarily develop maybe an aversion to it as quickly as someone who's following a strict meal plan or developing a mindset of I can only have this or I can only have that. One thing I don't want to not talk to you about, and I won't take up much more of your time after this, is I just want to know how do you apply? Because you're well educated. You're not just coaching to coach. You are well educated. So how do you apply? And we've talked about this personally, but how do you apply your Bachelor of Science degree in exercise physiology, as well as your NASM certification, to the work that you do, if at all?
Yeah, so that's a great question because I definitely don't want this to be misinterpreted the wrong way, but I feel like I've learned much more and have become the coach I have become today by just getting the experience, and furthermore being open to being a student of the sport, which I think is a really important character trait of all coaches, like realizing that okay, what you know today may not be what works best 3 years from now, right? You have to always be open to evolving and to learning, and being a student of the sport yourself, right? Because the sport is always evolving, you need to keep up. So although I think my degree and, my certifications have taught me like, the basics of how the human body works, right? Like, oh, I love my anatomy and physiology course in college. I was a lab assistant after I did that. So like I loved it. But do I actually like can I really think of like the times where I apply that hardcore to my client scenarios? Not really. So I think my degree and my certification definitely kind of gave me that segue into things and gives me a good understanding of how the body works, right? But it's the experience for coaching and mentoring under Paul and continuing to learn, going to seminars, asking the judges questions, asking questions, going to things like that has really what's been able to allow me to grow and evolve, I think, as a coach.
How did you know that Paul would be a good mentor for you?
That's a great question. I don't know. I just always, like I said, I watched him on YouTube when I was in high school, and he was kind of the first, like, it was him, Lane Norton, and Lauren Conlon, and ironically, they all live in Tampa and still do. Those were the three I really had like. Those are the first three I knew in this sport, right? And I think it's funny actually. I met Paul at my first show ever. He was not my coach at the time, but I remember I knew of him, and little Lexie at the time. I was pretty little, like I was tiny. I go up to him and just introduce myself. And I really remember, I still remember to this day that like the conversation was so easy with him and it was so fluid and wasn't like, nerve wracking. It flowed. And so I always to that, remember that that was so easy to talk to him. And then after that, I went to certain workshops he had here in Tampa and just kind of became a familiar face. He began to know me, and then I had always said, okay, this guy, I see that Paul is just such he cares about the athletes. Going back to what I said earlier about caring about the athletes as a person, like that is what he cares about, right? And I love that. Like he fits the morals of exactly who I want to be, right? So that's kind of ever since then, and just getting to know him more on a personal level, I've always known, okay, I wouldn't want to learn from anybody else.
That's really special. And you mentioned like the ability to speak with him is so easy. I've had that same experience with him. And I remember I was in Denver doing my own event, and it was also the same time the Pro Physique event was going on. And he's just, yeah, that was so random. And
Yes, yes, I remember that. Yes, it was like October of 2022.
yeah, it was so random, but it was awesome. And we all were working out at the same gym the same day. And I'm like, wait, what are y'all doing here? And it's like, oh, wow, the bodybuilding community is so big yet so small. Like
My gosh.
everyone.
Yes, absolutely. I do remember that. That's so funny.
So, Lexi, anything I didn't ask you that I should have? And if not, then how can people work with you and follow you?
Well, I think you are a great interviewer. I think we pretty much hit like everything I kind of wanted to touch on. But if those of you listening, I mean, even if you're not interested in my coaching, if you want to follow me, as I do try, like my fun fact, my word of the year is impact. So I really do try and put as much like valuable information out on my Instagram and my YouTube channel specifically. So that way, even if you're not a client of mine, you can still get some value. So my Instagram handle is just Lexie Mate, LEXIEMAIT. I try my best to respond to all DMs on there as well. So you can always get a hold of me there. And then you can find me on YouTube. My YouTube channel is linked on my Instagram, but you can also just search my first and last name and I'll pop up. I usually post a video at least once a week. And then, if you're interested in coaching, you can either my coaching link is on my Instagram. Again, everything is linked there, or you can specifically go to the ProPhysique website and request me as a coach if you would like.
Awesome. Well, we'll put that in the show notes page. You guys, that's always on celestial.fit/podcast. You can find it in the category section if you're not listening right away, or search for Lexi's name and it'll come up. Now, if you guys have follow-up questions or you have something you took away from this episode, tag us. Let us know what you learned. Let us know that you liked it. And thank you all for tuning in. And Lexi, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Celeste.